I've been watching the dietary food guidelines very closely for decades, and I never thought I would see what I just saw yesterday. And for the first time in history, they didn't just tweak the pyramid, they flipped it upside down. This is a massive win by RFK Jr. And yes, there are a few problems which we're going to cover, but mostly I am super excited because what this is going to do for children in schools, for hospitals, nursing homes, for the military, all these institutional foods, they're going to have to completely rewire the supply chains. You have to understand how radical this shift is. For over 40 years, the foundation of our guidelines were the grains being the base, okay? I mean, I'm talking between 6 to 11 servings of grains every single day. The entire past pyramids have been based on carbohydrates. But yesterday in this release, they walked away from that entire model. They didn't do what they normally did, which is adjust a few numbers. They actually talked about the food itself, which is enormous. But I think this didn't happen from just opinions. The data has been accumulating for years and years, and there had been a point where you just can't ignore it anymore. They now directly targeted in the crosshairs ultra-processed foods as being the primary driver of 90% of chronic disease. I'm talking about obesity, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver. For decades, the ultra-processed food companies were protected by silence, but now that's all gone. So there's no longer this cosmetic wording of making things sound really healthy. There's some pretty hardcore statements in this document. I'm going to put a link down below. Let's just compare and contrast the old model with the new model. In the old model, okay, it was recommended 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates. That is a massive amount of carbohydrates that turn into sugar in your body. They also recommended low fat. They also wanted you to do low cholesterol and low saturated fats. And of course, they focused on calories. Calories in equals calories out, right? Now, what's in the crosshairs is ultra-processed foods, emphasizing real foods, increasing protein, not from plant-based protein, from high-quality protein like red meat. And so the old recommendation for protein was 0.8 grams per kilogram. So with a 180-pound person, they would be recommended about 65 grams of protein per day. Now, the new recommendations for protein is 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And an average of a 180-pound person, we're talking 98 to 131 grams of protein per day versus the 65 grams over here. This is a massive shift because I already know, being in this field, a lot of people are deficient in high-quality protein. And just that recommendation alone is going to be huge to help your biochemistry, to help hormones, to help blood sugar. Now, what's really going to be interesting is how they're going to implement this because they're targeting ultra-processed foods as the enemy of health, okay? And so now, if you think about it, the entire foundation of our food supply is built on ultra-processed foods. Supply chains are geared towards delivering ultra-processed foods. Over 50% of our calories are ultra-processed foods. So I don't know how they're going to change that, but that's another problem with implementing these new recommendations. We've been for decades operating off of the wrong information. And the other delicate area I want to bring up is definitions. They are working right now on the definition of ultra-processed foods. And if I had my way, what I would start out doing is first talk about the definition of actual food. Not ultra-processed foods, but let's start with the definition of food because in another video I talked about this. What they did is they altered the definition of food and made it a legal definition, which basically means something that you eat that has nothing to do with the biological definition of food. So they're completely different. The legal definition of food is something that's edible and has a shelf-stable life, and that's pretty much it. It really has nothing to do with the biological definition, which has to support life. It has to help with growth and the repair of body tissue, but not the legal definition. So without getting that foundation, you can't then compare and contrast and then talk about what ultra-processed food is. If I had any input in it, I would start with going back to the biological definition of food, okay, and then anything that doesn't fit that, you can't call food. And that would be a huge game changer, because that would put a lot of awareness on things that you put in your mouth and get people to simply realize, just eat food, because this other thing over here is not food, because it cannot sustain health, life, it can't repair the body, it's going to basically create disease. Whoever controls the definition controls the outcome. They did this also with the definition of drug and disease, which I've talked about in other presentations, but the definition of food is very, very important. That which is eaten to sustain life, promote the growth and repair of tissues. The derivation means nourishment. Now, with all the good things that just happened, there's one main, big, missing piece of the puzzle, and that is the actual root cause of most chronic disease. I'm talking about insulin resistance. Now, some people are going to say, well, does it really matter? Because a lot of the foods that they're recommending and the changes will indirectly help prevent insulin resistance. That's true. But what about the people that already have insulin resistance? Will this new plan address that? I don't think so. Because when we're getting into correcting insulin resistance, it's super important to talk about how often you eat. Because if you apply this to your daily life as far as changing the foods, yet you're still having 3 meals, 2 snacks, you're grazing between meals, even if it's so-called healthy foods, you're still going to raise insulin. And every time you spike insulin with eating either healthy or unhealthy foods, you are contributing to this insulin resistance, and it's going to be almost impossible to reverse it, even if you're eating real foods. Now, you probably prevent it, but I don't know if you're going to actually reverse it, because the 2 things you have to focus on reversing it are doing low carb and, number 2, not eating so frequently. And so in the new dietary guidelines, insulin resistance wasn't mentioned. Also, they didn't get into intermittent fasting. But I'm telling you that so at least you'll know what you need to do to correct insulin resistance. And I really think the reason why they could not mention insulin resistance is because for years, they promoted a diet that actually causes insulin resistance. And for them to have to bring this up right now, it's incredibly embarrassing. They never like to be wrong. I mean, just take a look at cholesterol, right? In 2015, they very quietly removed the limits for cholesterol from our foods. Did they apologize for the last 40 years of telling us we had to get rid of cholesterol and go on statins? No, they didn't even mention that. But if you're talking 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates, you're talking about a massive spike in insulin. And also, if they brought up insulin resistance, they would also have to admit this whole calories in, calories out is completely non-valid, because they don't focus on the type of calories, which are calories that increase insulin, which then causes insulin resistance. Now, the last little thing I want to talk about with the new recommendations is saturated fat. Unfortunately, they still put the cap at 10% saturated fat. And that's one disagreement, because if you restrict saturated fat, what's left? We have unsaturated fatty acids like the seed oils. However, they did talk about ultra-processed foods, which also contain a lot of seed oils. They also talked about refined oils, okay? So that was good. But of course, they didn't really talk about how oil is oxidized, not just with heat, but by storage. And then one more point on this, they didn't mention the word industrial starches, but they did mention refined carbohydrates. And I don't even think people even know this word industrial starch. It is the refined carbohydrates. And I'm talking about flour products that you see, the wheat flour, but not just that. You have other words, modified corn starch, modified food starch, maltodextrin, which actually is hidden sugar, but it's not labeled as sugar. It's labeled as a carbohydrate and sugar-free, even though it will raise your blood sugar way more than actual sugar. But just realize this is targeted, and within this category, you have a lot of the hidden sugars as starches, and these are industrial starches that must go if we're going to turn this health around. But that being said, I am just ecstatic at this new flip on the food pyramid. I'm really excited about what it's going to do for our nation's health. And I'm real curious what you think about this, so comment down below. I have a free download that I want to give to you. This free download is my daily routine in a checklist. This is a routine that I use every day to feel like I'm 18 years old, even though I'm 60 years old, and I want to give it to you for free. And so there's a little link down below. Click it and definitely download that. And since the biggest thing that's missing in these new guidelines is intermittent fasting, if you don't know about that and you haven't implemented it, you must watch this video right now because this will explain exactly how to do it.